So this is how I usually go over the report. So the report breaks down 3D movement of a running analysis. So the first thing I'll look for is the sagittal plane. Sagittal plane is the first one I'm going to look at because usually when you correct something in the sagittal plane, it may bleed over into other planes of motion that we have accessible to our body. So I'll do sagittal plane first, frontal plane next, and then last will be the sagittal or rotational plane. So the first thing I look at is the pelvis. So you do have an anteriorly pelvic tilt position. So this is normally from a combination of hip flexor tightness or core tightness or a combination of both. Or it could just be simply that you are very relaxed when you're running in the core area, and that's just the default position that you're in. Most likely though, it's probably hip flexor tightness and core tightness, especially knowing that you have had children. So again, I'm making assumptions, I'd have to test it. That's the first thing we look at, anterior pelvic tilt. So we can do cues on that, we can do corrective exercise with that. Next up in the sagittal plane is hip extension. So usually with anterior pelvic tilt, if it's high, people can't access full hip extension. You do, which is really cool. That means you can access your glutes and be able to utilize that powerhouse of muscle groups to push off when you're running instead of all calf muscles. So that's great. That's one less thing you have to, correct or consider. Next in the chain is knee flexion. So how are you absorbing shock when your foot strikes the ground with your knees? So your knees are literally built-in struts. It looks like on the left you're doing a decent job with letting your knee flex to absorb shock. On the right, you're more on the below average side. So from there, I would maybe look at, quad strength, your eccentric strength, see how it's looking on that side, or if it's stemming from something else. Next up would be, what is the ankle doing? So are you forefoot striking? Are you midfoot striking? Are you striking the heel? You're definitely a heel striker, especially more so on the left side. And so that's the sagittal plane. So that's how I quickly review that. So basically from that alone, my assessment would be, what does your core strength look like? How are your hip flexors? Are they pretty tight? And then also too, I would look at the right quad, see how that's performing, especially in an eccentric controlled manner. And I wouldn't correct your heel strike. That's just what naturally your body wants to do. And that's the last thing I would mess around with before trying those other things. So next is the frontal plane. So I'm looking at the pelvis again, starting up the chain. So I'm looking to see if you have anything, it's called a hip drop. So is your hip muscle or your glutes doing a good job with keeping your pelvis level? And it looks as though the right side is doing a great job. Left side, you have some weakness there. So basically I would assume to look at the glutes again to see how well they're activating when you're standing on one leg, because it looks as though when you are running, the right side of your pelvis is dropping. So that means when you're standing on the left side, that glute's not quite doing its stabilizing job there. And next up would be hip adduction. How is your hip collapsing or your thigh coming inward to the midline of your body? Looks like it's ideal on the left side, and then on the right side, it's more on the stiff side. So based on this assessment, I would look at your mobility of your outer hip muscle groups. So think like IT band, outer quad, those muscle groups to see what's going on the right side. Am I picking up on something, or do I need to look at other areas? But usually you'll find mobility restrictions there from that stat. Next in the frontal plane would be, what is your knee doing relative, to your ankle and your hip? So how much of it's coming to the midline? It looks as though on the left and the right side, they're both coming past midline. So there's some knee collapse there that puts a lot of strain on the, foot structures as well as the inner knee areas. So I would look at ankle stability, again, what's going on at the hips. It looks as though more so on the left versus the right, you're having some weakness or lack of control in keeping that knee centered. So that is the frontal plane. Next is the transverse plane, so like the rotational type of movements. And first. Okay, here we go. Hip internal rotation. You're still in the ideal range. Left side is a little on the below average side, so I would kind of look and see if, you know, we're having some stiffness there in a different muscle group. Then I would test on the right. I want to know why that left side's not going inward. And it might not even be a hip thing. It could be something lower down the chain, like your foot and your ankle, which, you know, I'm a little biased because I know your presentation. That most likely is what's contributing to that lack of hip internal rotation. You're just a little more cautious of that rotational movement happening on the left side. And then I would look at the foot. So is your foot pronating? So foot pronation sounds like it would be a bad thing. It's actually a good thing because it's a shock absorbing capability of our foot and should be happening when you're accepting body weight on it. And then it becomes more rigid again to push off in the gait cycle. So it looks as though you're doing a great job with that on the right, but the left is stiff. The left foot is stiff. So you're not allowing your foot to come from the outer side to allowing the arch to be supple. So that could be contributing to your pain or be a compensation because of your pain. I'm going to say that it is a cause of the pain that you're experiencing. But again, you know, chicken or the egg. Either way, what I would do for that, I would help relax that foot and just show you the safe range and what it should feel like when that foot is relaxed and absorbing that shock in a more supported position than something like high impact. So that would be how I would address that. And that could work up the chain. You can see how if that becomes stiff, then maybe that influences the amount of hip internal rotation that we talked about earlier. It could influence that. So that's kind of like a breakdown of the part that you see with the form at the very beginning. That's very user-friendly for those who are receiving the report. As for me, I would do more of a deep dive into this part of the form itself. It shows a bit more information of the different body regions, so like the pelvis, the hip, the knee, the ankle, and the foot. And then it gives me the metrics too of your performance. So like how much are you bouncing up and down? Are you staying equally, you know, on one side versus the other? Are you overstriding? Are your foot, is your step width too wide? And you're falling in ideal ranges. There's a little bit of a difference between left and right as far as how much time you're spending on each side, but it's not something that I don't think will be not be corrected with the other metrics that I talked about in the videos. So that's the cool part of this form. It's like really detailed. It gets down to the nitty gritty, even goes into like again, it's not the stuff you need to worry about, but the different phases of the gait cycle in these different graphs. And then the different speeds that we did. So this is like your slower speed. And I love this bottom sheet because it shows you the slower versus the faster speed in the same metrics to see if you have a drastic difference with like a faster pace. And again, you stay pretty stable comparing the two different speeds, minus actually your foot. Surprisingly on the right side. Huh. Yeah, we should look into that. Like it looks like on the slower speed, you stay more on the outside of your feet. Interesting. Yeah, so your mechanics change a little bit at your foot and ankle area. As far as like your pelvis, your hip, your knee, you stay pretty consistent, but something's going on in like the forefoot area that's different at the speed, specifically on the right. A little bit on the left, but more so on the right that I didn't expect. Ooh, you have more of a medial heel whip at a slower speed too. Fascinating. Yeah, there's some things on here, but again, I would focus on really simple things first that, you know, and it's not changing your running pattern as far as like heel strike versus forefoot strike. It's more so like what's going on with the pelvis. Let's start at the core first, make sure you're stable there and see how that affects the joints below the pelvis. So like how does that affect the hips and the knees and the ankle and the foot?